in the House. And we have to go and have this absolutely ludicrous situation. We have to queue in Westminster Hall for like half an hour to be able to vote. They're about 2/3 of the way through the debate. So at some point, I'm going to have to leave this and go and vote. And actually, we've probably got 4 divisions. So the chance of me coming back before the end are pretty much 0. Not even net zero, just 0. So I'll have to leave you to carry on the session. So I'll just make some introductory remarks, and then I'll hand over to our first speaker. And I cannot find my notes to say who that is, but I'm sure that they'll know. So sorry about the slight chaos. So obviously this session's extremely important. Transport is, so it's Rachel, it's the Minister who's the first. Is that right, Jill?
Yes.
Right,
yeah.
So I can't see her, so I'm not sure if she's on the call at this point. Let me have a look at the participants tab.
No, she's not on there just yet, but she is dialing in.
Okay, so if she's not here, if Rachel's not here, I can see Kerry is here, so I'll hand over to Kerry, and hopefully I'll try and keep it short because obviously you want to hear from them before we go and vote. Then obviously trying to get them back will be very hard. So I'm just going to keep it very short actually, and then I'm going to hand over to whoever is on the line at that point. So transport's obviously a hugely important part of our economy and society, and I think probably COVID has thrown that into sharp relief. And the challenge of reaching net zero for transport is huge. In terms of surface transport is the largest emitting sector in the UK. And then on top of that, obviously, we have aviation and shipping. And that is in itself a contested area about how aviation shipping emissions should be included in the UK. The government have invested in surface transport. So there's a £2 billion package for cycling and walking. The last budget announced over half a billion pounds of investment for incentives for ULEVs, including expanding the in-vehicle charging infrastructure. There was some investment for hydrogen as well, and on-street charge points. There is high-tech funding about designing, testing, manufacturing electric vehicles, autonomous vehicle trials, etc. There are some particular challenges around heavy vehicles, whether that's buses, heavy goods vehicles for logistics and transportation. So there are some real big challenges where there aren't clear technological solutions at the market stage yet. In terms of the Committee on Climate Change reporting on our progress and meeting requirements under carbon budgeting for transport, we are woeful, I'm afraid to say. They've got 5 actions, and 3 of them we are completely not meeting, and 2 of them we're only partly meeting. So this is a real big area challenge for the government and for the UK. The Committee on Climate Change have put forward a number of recommendations around speeding up to meet the targets, including increasing the electrification of cars, vans and motorbikes, bringing forward the date for ending the sale of non-zero emission vehicles, looking at options for HGVs like hydrogen and electrification, although my personal view is that's very difficult to make HGVs electric. In terms of rail, to look at more electrification. Obviously the electrification programme is stalled, hydrogen trains, and then obviously modal shift to cycling, walking, etc., and improving logistics. The COVID crisis actually has highlighted some issues around logistics and a lot more people getting things delivered. And it's, if the delivery is via diesel vehicle, then we're never going to meet our ambition. So the new, we need to ensure fleet is moving to electrification for light goods vehicles, which are probably the most advanced bit of the sector. So I think I probably said enough in terms of an overview, and Just looking, we have the Minister here, and I think maybe it's now as good time to introduce Rachel and hand over, because I know we're on quite a tight timescale with the vote coming. So I'm really pleased you could make it, Rachel, and hopefully you've got some great things to say to reassure us that we can meet our ambitions in the carbon budget and for net zero in this area.
Thank you so much, Alex. I hope you can hear me. I think I'm switched on. Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And thanks so much for inviting me along. And obviously, yes, mindful of votes, and very happy to accept the challenge that you've just laid down. I was delighted when I was told that I was being invited to join the government and take on this particular role, because I've been a campaigner on net zero and climate for quite some time, even before I joined the Department for Transport. And as you rightly said, obviously transport is one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise, but we are embracing this challenge. I've obviously prepared a few remarks, and I'm very happy to speak in more detail to your members. I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm just literally trying to switch between screens as I'm speaking, which is a problem that's hopefully we resolve very soon. Will you just forgive me just for 1 second while I attempt to open my document that I had ready? Thank you very much. Okay, so look, it's a real pleasure to address your group and to address parliamentarians from across the spectrum. And of course, we have had a really challenging few months. And I want to thank once again all the workers across the transport sector who've made a huge effort to keep this country on the move during this difficult time. But we are determined to continue our unrelenting focus on our longer term priorities. And decarbonising transport is an issue that is right on top of the list of concerns, not only for this government, but for the general public as well. And I'm sure that all of you will also be experiencing what I am as a constituency MP, with people saying, how do we embed some of these changes, these positive changes? So you've already alluded that we had been gearing up for a major year of climate action before the pandemic struck. We would have had COP26. And sadly, that's had to be delayed until next year. But we are still driving forward the plans behind those talks, and they are still very much alive. And I see transport as absolutely heart of a green recovery for this country. So transport is the sector that emits the most greenhouse gases in the UK. In 2018, for instance, it contributed 28% of UK domestic emissions. Since 1990, other sectors have reduced their emissions dramatically, contributing to a 43% fall in domestic emissions over the past 30 years, but transport has only dropped by 3%. And so if we are going to meet our legally binding pledge to reduce emissions to net zero, this has got to change. And that is why we are developing our transport decarbonisation plan. And this is going to set out a clear roadmap for achieving net zero in every mode of transport, including those hard to decarbonise modes that you've mentioned, Alex: container ships, trains, buses, and of course, planes. It is a truly groundbreaking piece of work. It is the first time that the Department of Transport has considered this goal across all the modes of transport, and it's the biggest ever piece of work focusing on reducing transport greenhouse gas emissions. We can only achieve our goals if we work together across all the modes. And so this new holistic approach will enable us to work as one to decarbonise in a much quicker, more unified and structured way. But we do understand and we recognise that there can be no one-size-fits-all approach, and that the plan must be flexible enough to be fine-tuned to the specific needs of different communities, whether they're urban or rural. In March, we kicked off our work on the plan with a landmark document setting out the challenge before us, and that laid out the scale of the additional emissions reductions that will be needed to meet those legally binding carbon budgets and deliver net zero. And we don't shy away from the fact that this journey won't be easy, and we need to make radical shifts in the way transport operates in this country. Some of the changes, for example, the switch to electric vehicles, are well underway, and over the long term, they will deliver substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But if we are to achieve the results that are undoubtedly needed, we have to think about wider action. And we have to ask ourselves big questions about the way we get around and how goods and services reach us. While we're focusing all of this, at the same time, we must rapidly develop and deploy green technologies for traditionally hard to green sectors like freight, maritime and aviation, including further battery technology, new fuels and hydrogen. It's an enormous task, and it must be shared. And so it's crucial that we listen to a wide range of voices across the industry and across the public, and of course with relevant groups. It's only by working together that we will achieve our goals. And the past few weeks, I think, have been evidence of that. While coronavirus has meant that we've been dogged with sadness and tragedy, we've also done some extraordinary things. We have built new hospitals, we found new ways of working and fast-tracked new laws. And many of us have become alive to the benefits of travelling in cleaner and greener ways, for example, by walking and cycling. And that's resulted in lower emissions, cleaner air and quieter streets, transforming the environment. There's amazing statistics that come out of this. In the UK, nitrogen dioxide at the roadside has almost halved, and globally greenhouse gas emissions can see their largest ever annual drop. But we must lock in these benefits, keep this momentum going and create lasting changes. Changes that will help make our country greener and healthier and provide clean economic growth. We have made a major step on this front earlier this month when we launched our £2 billion fund to boost cycling and walking, the largest ever investment in this area. And we've announced plans to fast track trials of e-scooters, which shows major progress, and it shows a focus on rebuilding from this crisis to create lasting change. But of course we know that as more people return to work, journeys will increase and so will emissions. And that's why our long-term focus must be on creating a green recovery with transport at its heart. This is an approach that will link measures to boost sustainability with economic stimulus to the places that need it most, improving the environment, but at the same time developing skills and providing access to high quality jobs in the clean industries of the future. It will be a major step in levelling up the country and enable us to thrive in a new world outside the EU. Finally, I want to thank you by listening to me today, and I'll wind up with a quote from Albert Einstein. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. And that's especially true if we are to meet our 2050 net zero goals. We need a shift in mindset. And I hope I proved today that while we have some way to go, our thinking in government has changed and changed for the better. And I am optimistic that if we continue to work together, we unrelentingly maintain our focus on our shared aim of decarbonisation, we can overcome these challenges and we can renew and revitalise this country. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I think I've got some time to take questions, Alex, but over to you.
Sorry, I muted myself there. So maybe thinking about this, I'm very conscious of the time, that we maybe will take questions, may take 3 questions and then let Perry in, and then hopefully then we'll get to that point before the bell goes. So, and I'll take all 3 questions together. So maybe if you can indicate in the chat if they would like to ask any questions.
I can see that Lord Oates has got his hand up there if he'd like to go first.
Great. So if Lord Oates, yeah.
Thanks very much. Johnny Oates here. I wondered if the Minister might be able to just say a bit more about the role that transport can play in the green recovery, and do you have any particular thoughts about how to target job-rich opportunities? That's the first thing. And then briefly, if she has time, I just wondered if she might be able to say a bit more about when the trial of e-scooters will come to a definitive conclusion.
Thanks, Johnny. E-scooter is a passion of mine as well. Anybody else want to ask a question? Yep, Alan.
Unmute.
Do we need to unmute Alan? Can he do it himself?
Apologies, you'd think I'd be used to this by now. Rachel, you mentioned about electric vehicles well on their way, but in actual fact, for me, the sale of electric vehicles in the UK is still way too low. And when you compare to likes in Norway, they're far, far ahead. So just wondering if you can elaborate more on that, and when the government's going to have a clear roadmap, for want of a pun, for the complete phasing out of carbon-based vehicles. Obviously, it brought forward the target date to 2035, but the Committee on Climate Change had already said there's no clear pathway to the 2040 target, even though they hoped it would be brought forward. So I just wondered what the government thinking is to make sure that these targets are met.
Thanks, Alan. And I think Baroness Randerson will round us off for this round of questions.
Thank you. When I raise the issue of the infrastructure we require for electric vehicles, I'm told by ministers that the industry must lead. But actually the industry tells me they need guidance. They need to be led in themselves in a particular direction. So I'd like to know what the government is doing to ensure that there is a much more even rollout of electric vehicle charging points, not just on motorways, but in towns and major roads generally, and what the government is doing to ensure that those charging points are open to everyone who needs them, by not having devious and complex ways of paying for the electricity you need.
Thank you, Baroness. Right, Minister, would you like to come back on those three? I think we'll then still have time for Kerry before the bell goes.
Certainly will, and I'll try and keep it quickly. So Baroness Randerson, thank you. I've seen lots of your correspondence. I know what an interest you take in this particular area, and I agree with you that we need that infrastructure. And as far as the government's concerned, we are not leaving it to industry to lead on this. We are investing significant sums of money. You will have heard the Secretary of State for Transport just at the last press conference talking about the amount of money that's going into the charging network, the rapid charging network on our strategic road network, which is absolutely essential for anyone that has to drive long distances. I'm very lucky. I have an EV, but it's got quite a long range, and I was okay to get down here from my constituency in Redditch down to London. First time I've ever driven down. I normally take the train, but obviously we're not doing that now. But I know that other people cannot do that, and we need to get those ranges up. We need to eliminate that range anxiety. So the money is going in to enable us to get these charging points in motorway service stations. We're also doing a lot of work to address problems of people that don't have their own front drive or can't actually charge their EV in their own drive. We are doing work joint with MHCLG to try and crack on and beat through some of the bureaucracy that's surrounding us, actually being able to install charging points in not in new builds but in old builds to retrofit them. So there's lots of different pieces of work that are going on, and I'm absolutely passionate about this, and I'm constantly pushing on the department to go faster and look at what we can do more of. But we understand that it does require government investment to lead, and I think you'll see that coming in, and there's going to be more of it. You're right to raise the problem about the charging and the connection charges, and that's something that I'm having regular discussions with Ofgem about. On the from Alan's question about phasing out, you mentioned that you think the take-up of EVs is too low. Of course, it's not where we want it to be, but we are already seeing quite a significant uptick in electric vehicle registrations. I think last year was a record high, and I don't have that stat right in front of me, but we did see a significant uptake in EVs. And now that car showrooms are opening again, we really want to encourage people to consider, if they are buying a car now, please think about buying an EV, because we know that there is a lot of misconception in the public's minds about the cost of EVs. Actually, there are EVs that are able to buy with people on very moderate incomes. They do compare very favourably with ICE engine cars, but we also recognise again that the government needs to provide more certainty for car manufacturers to actually come in and continue to innovate so that new models come onto the market. And I think that's part and parcel to your other question about how do we actually reach this phase out point. So you'll know that we've got a consultation about bringing forward that 2035 date. That has been, the closing date for that has been delayed a little bit because of the pandemic. I believe that we will be closing that within a couple of weeks, and then we will be able to analyse all the responses and make sure we take into account all the responses from industry, from all the relevant stakeholders, and that's when we can come forward and publish that response, because we are determined to do it. We are determined to bring this forward, and we believe it is achievable, and we know that government intervention is going to be required, and we need to understand what government intervention that is. So Lord Oates, you very pertinently asked a question about the transport green recovery, and again this is something that we are just beginning to put into place, and I'm leading on that work in the department. It is absolutely, as you say, about looking at where has the economy been impacted by this pandemic. We want to have a cleaner and a greener recovery, but we also want to use that to, if you like, level up the country. That's part of our overall objective. And one very good example I can think of is the Northeast. We've got a number of very interesting projects going on there around biofuels, for example. We've also got a thriving renewable sector there. That's an area where with some kind of targeted government intervention, we could potentially seed investment into some of those nascent industries, provide that government support, so then that they can go on and create those skilled jobs. I think it's really important that we work with the DfE and that we work across the piece, because we know that we're going to need people to be reskilled into some of these new industries. We're going to need people who are going to be able to work on, for example, EVs that we were just talking about. Your other question about the e-scooters, the consultation has closed today on that, and we've received a good number of expressions of interest. The department will now be working with those local authorities, and we hope to get the trials up and running very quickly, and they will last for 1 year, and that, we believe that will give us a good time to actually make sure that we understand all the issues, and then we can get the data, and then we can make the right policy choices. It's clearly an area where the public have got a lot of interest, and there are some very considerable issues around public safety, road use and so on, and we want to do it in a proper and safe way. I think I've done the questions, and I leave time for somebody else.
Thanks. I mean, we've got about, I reckon, 13 minutes until the vote. So I think that the best thing to do with the time we've got is to bring Kerry in, and for Kerry to speak, and then to do some questions. And I see Alan's joined us as well, who's Shadow Minister in Bays. Hi, Alan. So I've been on the Environmental Audit Committee with Kerry for the last 3 years, so I know that Kerry is not just knowledgeable but passionate about the subject. And I think cycled 6 miles today to get to Parliament. Is that right, Kerry? So she's walking the talk like Rachel with her electric car. Kerry also has electric, and we've got a hybrid, so a bit behind these innovators. So Kerry, over to you.
Okay, yeah, so I drove down from Bristol last night in my electric car, had to stop to charge at Membry Services, and got to Parliament gone midnight, and then cycled for the first time in central London back to the flat. And it was meant to be 6 miles, but I wasn't quite sure where I was going, so I think I sort of it took me quite a long time. But this morning it was all really smooth, and it's absolutely lovely, the fact that, you know, when you go through, say, Oxford Street, it's pedestrianised. So that would be my starting point, is that the situation now with coronavirus does offer us a real opportunity to promote active travel, which is in my brief, as well as decarbonisation of transport. There are some really good local authorities that have really sort of seized the initiative with the pop-up bike lanes, partly closing off streets, widening pavements to allow for social distancing, taking away parking bays on streets. So and I've been talking to as many councils as possible as that. I suppose there's an issue about what do you do if some of the local authorities aren't as keen to seize that agenda. I think there needs to be more pressure put on them from central government, and there's particularly an issue where perhaps district councils want to do things but the shire counties aren't prepared to support them in that. So the other thing that I've been asking from central government is just more clarity about legal powers, and trying to make the whole process about TROs and experimental traffic orders quicker, cheaper, less likely to be challenged in the courts. So we need to embed this change now, because if we don't embed it as soon as possible, because of the restrictions on public transport, the fact that the social distancing means that capacity is going to be severely reduced down to about a quarter of what it should be, if not less. The real danger is, and we saw Grant Shapps say this, I think, in the statement, that they were urging people not to go on public transport, but to get into their cars. So we've got to make it as safe and as easy as possible for people to cycle. And that includes things like the Cycle to Work scheme, which I'm very glad has been rolled out to e-bikes, which I've just put down a deposit on one. So I'm looking forward to going up the hills in Bristol, because Bristol, you've got to be pretty fit to get up some of those hills. E-scooters, I'm slightly ambivalent about. Bristol's going to be one of the places that pilots it. I gather it's going to be rental schemes to start with. Some of my concern, I'm supporting it, I want it to happen, but my concerns are that from what I've been told, it's not really a modal shift from getting people out of their cars. People tend to use e-scooters instead of walking. So what are you just then clogging up the bike lanes or the shared space with people that would otherwise be walking? There's also an issue about the dockless ones and whether they're just going to be littered all over the, just sort of dumped in places. I've been talking to disability campaigners, and I think it's really important that we factor them in when we make these changes. So for example, if you're widening the pavements, you're creating shared space, the ramps that they might go down will have disappeared. People who are visually impaired, the pavements will suddenly have changed, and there might be all sorts of things that weren't there before that they've suddenly got to cope with. So I think it's really important that we make sure that it's accessible for everybody still. So yeah, that is the key thing, is active travel, and also just from the point of view of public health and air pollution as well. There's a whole discussion to be had about what's going to happen with the clean air zones. On electric vehicles, Labour had a manifesto commitment to try to stop the sale of new diesel and petrol by 2030. I think the government is 2035, but ideally sooner. We need to see a lot more detail from them as to how we will actually make that shift, because electric vehicles are only a few percent of the market at the moment. Charging infrastructure is certainly part of that, and dealing with range anxiety, but the fact still is that electric vehicles are out of most people's price range. On aviation, and I'll finish on this because I do want to let other people in, Labour published a 5-point plan on aviation bailouts. I think Alan might be able to say something on this as well, but one of those was very much that airlines would be expected to step up and do more to meet the climate commitments. I'm having conversations with people about the sustainable fuels side of that. I have concerns about biofuels, because whereas you might be addressing the emissions point, if you're contributing to deforestation and changes of land use, that's pretty environmentally unsound in a very different way. But there is some interesting work, and Alan is the absolute expert on all things energy and fuel related. So I will leave that to him, but I'll just finish by saying I do think it's a real opportunity, but I think we need to act as quickly as possible to make sure that transport is part of this green recovery, and that we see a modal shift that isn't just temporary, it's something that becomes embedded in people's way of life.
Thanks, Kerry. I think we still got 5 to 7 minutes before the bell goes. So if we take a round of questions for Kerry, and then maybe if there's still time left, we can take questions for both Kerry and Rachel, and really push the boat out. So in the unlikely event. So I'll take questions from parliamentarians, and if not, then I think we can go to the other attendees as well, I think, if we have the ability to do that, Emily. So yes. Have we got any parliamentarian questions? Just looking. No. So do we have questions from other panelists? Emily, how do we bring people in? Or do we just take them from the chat?
So I can see that Natasha has got her hand up there. So if we take one from Natasha, and then Mark Jenkinson, and then we'll go to the chat if no one else raises their hand.
Right.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for the speakers, for the both who have spoken already. I've just got a quick question which I hope to cover in my session later on, but really it's about, as we think about the intrinsic link between the energy space and transport, I was interested to know thoughts from both the speakers around, you know, how they see that playing out in the future, with specific reference to how we manage energy at a local level and how we deal with the constraints that will come from more localised use of electric vehicles and also use of heat pumps. So I'm thinking specifically around energy flexibility and how that will play through.
Thank you, Natasha. And who's the other one? Can't see a hand.
We'll go to Mark Jenkins.
Mark Jenkinson.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question was the points about lock-in benefits. So how do we actually avoid, as was mentioned, that people, once we end up, if we do move the cycle lanes that have been put in place, how do we ensure that we do continue with these and continue this shift towards cycling and walking?
Thank you. And then I think what I'll do is take a third one from the chat. So the first one on the chat that I can see is Cara Jenkinson. I don't know if you can see it, Kerry, but it says, should government implement scrappage schemes for people to exchange ICE vehicles for EVs? So you want to take those three, Kerry, and then we'll probably be at the bell. Oh, you're on mute.
I think was the first question, was that for Rachel as well, I think, or both of them were, I think maybe for Rachel as well, but I might ask Alan to come in on the first one because it's a bit more up his street. In terms of the scrappage scheme, I think it's certainly worth considering a sort of diesel scrappage scheme. Yeah, I think that's, I need to look at the numbers in terms of how that would be costed and so on. But I also think that if you had incentives for car manufacturers to reach certain targets in terms of abortion of production, which I think is a thing in the EU, then that would drive them making the switch and hopefully bring the price down as well as they switch the models. In the last question, was that about embedding change? Sorry, I haven't got a pen here, so I haven't.
Yes,
I haven't got the
locking in the benefits of the changes to cycle lanes.
Travel. Yeah, that's what I thought. So I think, yeah, this is. It's an ideal opportunity because actually, as I know from cycling in this morning, I would never, I think, have normally dared to cycle through central London. And it's, you know, apart from a few busy bus lanes, it's the ideal time for people to learn. But I think in terms of encouraging people to make that shift, it is going to be quite a small window before people start returning to their cars, and it becomes quite unpleasant to do that again. You can build in, so we've had these pop-up bike lanes and the sort of temporary infrastructure, and it's to what extent you can turn that into proper infrastructure that's going to be there permanently. And there's an issue about perhaps making the TRO regime easier, so that, because there's quite a long consultation period for permanent changes. So that's one of the things I've written to Grant Shapps about. I think also it's, you know, it is partly about safety and equipping people with bikes. I think the government's coming up, when I appreciate Rachel doesn't cover cycling and walking, but we're trying to find out a bit more about the bike repair voucher scheme that they've mentioned, so that it can become affordable for people. I'm very conscious that there's quite a class issue. I mean, certainly in Bristol, but I think in, you know, your average London boroughs and that as well, where it's actually quite a middle class pursuit, cycling, and quite a white pursuit. And we have people on the outskirts of the city that have pretty poor transport links to where the jobs are. And, you know, I'm very interested in looking at how we can get e-bikes to that community. It's obviously a lot cheaper than cars, and it would mean that they could make that journey across the whole city to the jobs in the northern fringe. But they are not people that are going to be able to shell out £1,000 even under a cycle to work scheme. So I think we need to look at what we can do in terms of targeting particular areas as a sort of strategic approach. And what was the first question, Alex? I remember thinking at the time that this sounds like Alan.
Natasha, yeah. Alan, did you catch the question from Natasha at Centrica?
No, I didn't. My contact's not very good. So
okay. Natasha, you want to
Does
summarise
Natasha
it
want to
quickly?
repeat it very briefly?
Yeah. So thank you, Shadow Minister, and also to Rachel as well. So the question was really, as we think about transport and the energy and electricity needs that will be required, for me, from a Centrica perspective, clearly we are involved in EV infrastructure, but also more broadly in the energy system. And for me, I'm really interested in how those two worlds are going to come together in a policy way, in a really meaningful way, to ensure that we've got the right balancing mechanisms at a local level, because we know that EVs are going to cause more local energy issues rather than national ones.
I think, are you happy to do that, Alan? Because I think it is, you are the energy expert.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is the sort of big question of just what sort of future demand a wide deployment of EVs is going to place on generation requirements. And secondly, as Natasha has said, bearing in mind that generation is going to relate to the grid in very different ways than was previously the case, i.e. so much generation coming in on a distributed level that the old methods of balancing the system will probably not be appropriate in the future. So combination of what sort of generation you're going to need, and secondly, how the generation that you do need is going to be balanced across, bearing in mind that you'll have a very substantial demanding system. I'm not desperately worried about that, to the extent that what's happening now with National Grid particularly is that they are moving ahead quite rapidly on methods of much better visibility in the system in order to enable the system to take on board the degree of renewables that we think are going to be in the system in the not too distant future. So there was a considerable area of concern, if you like, just a few years ago, that firstly you'd need huge amounts of generation. Well, that's largely been overcome, I think, by movements forward on smartening the system and deploying resources in a much more managed way. And so, I mean, a number of the studies more recently have shown that probably the need for additional generation is going to be only about 11-12% more than you've got at the moment for a pretty widespread deployment of EVs. So provided generation can be managed in a much smarter way, and provided, and I think this is the key, that actually distribution systems need to become much more localized and move from distributed network organizations to distributed service organizations to manage the grid locally on a smart basis, and put into that management of demand at the same time. Interestingly, we've seen some of the effects just recently of a lowering of demand, which I anticipate will come with a number of these things that are off grid at the moment and will be in future off grid, and the management of the grid as it works. So I think that will work quite well in together. But what I am concerned about is if you add the decarbonisation, the complete electrification of heat on the back of all that. So I think we've actually got to try and integrate what we're doing on decarbonisation of heat with electric vehicle grid management over the period. But the challenge, I think, is going to come not in supply, but probably in things like whether you can get really fast charging and what sort of power that's going to need at various times, and whether you can manage that properly in terms of the immediate supplies you've got at a particular local level. And I hear the beller's just going.
Bell is going, and it's very noisy. So I think the four of us that are in Parliament are going to have to leave you, and the other parliamentarians who are not in Parliament probably are able to stay. And I'll hand you over to Jill and Emily now. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and hopefully we'll be less interrupted in the next one of these calls. Thank you. Bye-bye. And thanks to Rachel and Kerry and Alan.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thanks for your time. Obviously, it's all gone a bit back to front because that's we were meant to be having that kind of conversation later on after we'd heard from our industry and academic panel. So I think without further ado, we will introduce our panel. And so first off, it will be Suki Dougal from Atkins, followed by Natasha, who we've already heard from, then Vincent Darul from EDF, then we have Graham Cooper from National Grid, which we also had reference to just now from Alan Whitehead around future grid recognition. So we are all meant to be, and Brenda Boardman also will be coming on the call. We've talked a lot around active travel already, but each of the panelists have been sort of looking at a particular question, but I'm going to ask Suki from Atkins just to talk us through roughly around how do we decarbonise transport and meet the net zero targets. So over to you, Suki.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jill. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, firstly, thanks very much for accepting me to your group. Really looking forward to just discussing this. But as Jill has mentioned, my name is Suki Dougal. I'm a client director within Atkins, and I lead our response to decarbonisation in transport. Really delighted here to talk about this difficult challenge around decarbonisation and meeting net zero targets. And I think the key thing for me is we can make some decisions now that can actually have an impact later on. Atkins is an engineering consultancy working across energy, transport and infrastructure. And actually, I think for us, it's really critical that we think about net zero actions across all these sectors. Otherwise, we might miss a trick, and the balancing with energy, for example, is one of those. The other thing I'd like to say up front is that decarbonisation needs to work hand in glove with other macro objectives that the country has, such as levelling up or improving the resilience of our infrastructure or reviving the economy. And in fact, if we don't do this, we risk having solutions that are not going to stand the test of time and are going to be suboptimal. In the next slide, I've just called out some net zero actions that can be taken now to support the drive to decarbonisation and also some of these wider objectives. So on this slide, you can see that all the modes of transport are represented in the centre here, and we must remember we can't forget the interplay between those modes of transport. For each mode, we do need to support behavioural change and nudge transport demand appropriately, and we've already talked about that. And as part of our COVID-19 situation, we've already discussed active travel, cycling and walking, so has forcibly promoted that there is a need of cycling and walking. There's been an uptake as a consequence. And I think actually, for example, TfL in London are forecasting there might be a 5-fold, if not a 10-fold increase in cycle travel. What the challenge here is we need to continue to promote cycling and walking and these other mechanisms by funding these to support the behaviours that are already starting to move in this direction. That's the first thing we need to do. We also need to encourage trust and acceptance of public transport given social distancing. Currently, public transport capacity is down, maybe a quarter of the normal rates, and people may be afraid of using public transport and therefore want to use road transport and the internal combustion engine as an example. One thing that we think that needs to happen is greater transparency and use of real-time information on public transport, for example, on bus capacity. We think that this can optimise bus usage and support smoother demand of that type of travel. Third point is around business cases and the direct need to consider decarbonisation now and biodiversity gains actually as part of investments, as part of a broader analysis of impacts. Not only we think this will result in a better stakeholder engagement, but it will also provide access to more green funding and financing, which is likely to become more available. And finally, we just discussed e-scooters, electric vehicles, and also electrification in rail. That it will have a significant impact on demand. And I think, that previously we have spoken about there being an energy gap. And whilst nuclear and renewables and hydrogen and others might come on board, we need to really manage that energy gap. And we think an energy systems architect approach across all sectors, transport infrastructure and energy is needed. The next slide actually talks about balancing the modes are required, and I'm going to show this on this systems view. It's a complex diagram, and you're not meant to see the details, but the long and the short of it is each of the modes are representing one of those tube lines, those different coloured tube lines. And we know that there's going to be intersections where we need to think about making specific decisions as represented by those stations on those tube lines. But we believe if you actually think about those systematically and across a systems point of view, we can have certainly a more dynamic and resilient view and a series of actions that will result in clean and inclusive growth. So just to summarise on the next slide, my final slide, we do have a window of opportunity now to make the right net zero actions. And I think as part of our COVID emergency, this really gives us an opportunity to release in a decarbonised way, testing new approaches and ways of delivery. And I believe if we implement these actions right, considering a systems view, I believe we can engineer net zero transport and also achieve the wider economic and society benefits I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much, Jill.
That's great. Thanks very much for that. And I think that gives us a healthy start to answering some of these very important questions. So we've next got Natasha from Centrica, whose question is going to be around technology. What technology, systems and policies do we need to reach the 2050 target? Again, I know, Natasha, you've already kicked that off a little bit, but over to you now. You've got Natasha.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I was pleased to be able to flag some of the important issues around kind of energy and flexibility ahead of our MPs leaving us, or many of them leaving us. I'll start by just saying, so I head up Centrica's policy and advocacy for electric vehicles and energy solutions. As a company, we serve 26 million customers globally, and we're supporting customers with both their energy transition and also their energy needs. So it goes without saying, I'm really delighted to be able to share some thoughts today around policy and decarbonisation of transport, and given time I'll be focusing in on electric vehicles. So if we move to the first slide, as Centrica, we've got the ability to deploy end-to-end energy and charging solutions. So we've learned a huge amount from doing that with our customers. Recently, we've been able to announce some really exciting partnerships with a number of car manufacturers, and those include the likes of Lotus and VW Group. More broadly, as a company, we're supporting fleets, workplaces, homes and destinations with their immediate EV charging needs and also energy needs, but also longer term, we're working to develop solutions for the future, such as home energy management, where the worlds of the car and the home start to come together. As a company, our British Gas fleet, we have our own challenges around electric vehicles. So we have the largest commercial fleet in the UK with around 11,000 vehicles. We're committed to going fully electric by 2030, but like many others, we have the same barriers of cost and access to charging, which actually is a huge issue for our return to home fleet. The government policies around this have a huge and direct impact on our decision making, and I'd be happy to expand on this in the Q&A. Before I deep dive on kind of EV policy, I think we'll just touch on some of the other technologies very, very briefly. So we know that electrification's generally going to work for the majority of lightweight vehicles, and there are some use cases for heavier vehicles such as buses. But as alluded to earlier from Alex, he said that we haven't got all the solutions on this. When we think about harder to abate areas such as aviation or HGVs, some of the solutions will probably lie in things such as sustainable biofuels, and I know that was touched upon earlier, and I think that's where the importance of using waste-derived biofuels comes in. For HGVs, biomethane as well, that's something worth flagging. It's something that Centrica is involved in as well, in terms of that creation of the biomethane for use in HGVs. Longer term, hydrogen as well goes without saying. There's a role for that, but clearly that's a huge issue which we can't necessarily tackle right today in this conversation. So I think the main thing to say is that, as always, government support to ensure that fuel switching can occur will clearly be key. So if we go to the next slide, specifically looking at EV policy. So we know that accelerating that transition to EVs is a cornerstone of meeting net zero, and as mentioned earlier by the Minister, there's a huge amount of policy work going on, and it goes without saying that infrastructure for those without off-road parking is a huge issue, and one I mentioned earlier, which is a big issue for our British Gas fleet as well. Given that I think there's 3 policy areas that I'd want to pull out for discussion, all of these are under development or consultation right now, so the front and centre, I'm sure, of many people's minds. So the first one is around the date for the internal combustion engine phase out. The second is around supporting that smart EV charging infrastructure that's been mentioned a few times. And then the third one is around the wider energy policy considerations. So if we think about the first item around the internal combustion phase out date, so we really believe this should be 2030. This move would do 2 things. So firstly, it's going to send a signal to manufacturers that the UK is a relevant marketplace. It's particularly important as we're a right-hand drive market, and obviously this represents higher costs for manufacturing. Crucially though, this needs to be dealt with alongside the issue of European tailpipe regulations in a post-Brexit world. As we know, this has been a key driver for ensuring that we have EVs in the UK marketplace. So that's a dual challenge. On the consumer side, an earlier date also gives people confidence that the government is really committed to making EVs a reality for the everyday person. And in support of this, we believe that funding to help with the cost of charging infrastructure and also vehicle purchase should be continued until the middle of 2020, when we expect EVs will reach cost parity with the internal combustion engine. And alongside this, as what I've mentioned previously, we really think that we need the creation of local flexibility markets to manage those local power issues that we spoke about, and we think they're needed by 2023. Looking on the second item around smart charging and flexibility, as mentioned earlier, we know that EV electricity demand will increase by 2050. Alan mentioned the good news is that at a national level we'll have the supply. The challenge is more at a local level. And so, you know, it's really essential that if we want to manage our peak demand, that we've got these flexibility markets and we're able to make it cheaper for everybody. The alternative is just using expensive and disruptive network upgrades to deal with the increased demand, and we don't believe that that can be the only option. Clearly, alongside this, the ability for consumers to change when they charge is key to the energy system, and making sure that customers are really rewarded for doing things that are helpful for the energy system. This not only helps them to be involved in the energy system, but also helps them basically play a role, and their EVs play a role. And we also believe that it's important that suppliers and aggregators manage this smart charging future. To this end, we believe that government should be using the Energy White Paper and the Decarbonisation of Transport Plan to set a policy objective to deploy flexibility as a key enabler to meeting net zero at least cost. So I think those 3 items are the ones I really wanted to pull out, but notwithstanding the fact there are huge swathes of policy work that are going on at the moment. So I think just to finish, I think it's worth mentioning, alongside many others, that as a company we're really supportive that we build back better after the coronavirus, and you know, we believe it's so important to continue the momentum gained around tackling climate change prior to the outbreak once we return to some level of normality. And in the meantime, our thoughts go out to all those who've been affected so far. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Natasha. That's great. And I think we'll hear a lot more around the need for flexibility in a post-COVID world, and also in terms of the regulatory environment and moving forward. So that's really good. Thanks very much. And next we have Vincent Derall from EDF, and he's looking very much at the decarbonisation of low carbon transport and how you make it more accessible. But over to you, Vincent.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this great panel. A lot of really interesting discussion so far. So by way of a brief introduction to EDF, so we are the UK's largest producer of low carbon electricity, operating 8 nuclear power plants and more than 30 wind farms in the UK, as well as 1 gas and 1 coal power station. And we also operate the biggest battery storage facility in the UK. We are also investing in new energy infrastructure, including EV, and I will illustrate that a bit later. And that's one of the ways we are supporting the UK in its transition to a cleaner and low emission electric future. This is really something where EDF is really committed to. If you can move to the next slide. So what we've heard already today, and is really a very important step of moving to net zero is the electrification of transport. And what we know is that if you compare the energy sector and the transport, the energy sector in the last 20 years have reduced its carbon footprint by 60%, while, as said by the minister earlier today, the transport sector has reduced by only 3%. So there is definitely a big gap here that needs to be filled. But we also see that the EV market is growing. In the UK, if you look at 2020, we have about 300,000 EVs on the road. And we believe that by 2030, this can be almost up to 5 million vehicles. And hopefully by 2035, is going to be 10 million vehicles. If you look at that and you look at the electrification of the transport, and you push as much as possible also the generation of low carbon energy, our estimation shows that we can save up to 60 million tons of CO2 per year. So that's something that is absolutely key in our capability to reach net zero. If you can move to the next slides, please. So a bit of illustration of what EDF is doing in terms of supporting the electrification of transport. So first, I will start with saying that we already offer to the market one of the most competitive low carbon electric vehicle tariff that we call Go Electric, which allows customers to benefit from I would say peak and off-peak tariff to optimize the energy consumption and to make sure that you benefit from the lowest tariff when charging your car, for example. In 2019, we've made the acquisition of Pivot Power, who is a company that is operating in the battery storage and EV charging infrastructure area. And Pivot Power is absolutely key to contribute to, I would say, or to support to the net zero ambition of the UK by installing a battery storage solution that will bring flexibility and also the appropriate rapid charging that will help customers to I would like to say go through the range anxiety. We also have a partnership, or we have some interest in the UB3City company. So UB3City offers solutions to those without off-street parking by providing charging points in existing on-street infrastructure, including lamppost and bollard. So this is a very important and very easy, I would say, solution for, in particular, for public authorities, and they have already more than 1,800 public access charging points installed in the UK by UB3City. Finally, as a last I would say investment or contribution to the electrification of transport, and we all know that a big part of that is the capability to have the right charging infrastructure available for people to charge their car. So earlier this year, EDF has acquired SpotPoint, which is one of the largest charging point operator in the UK, that offers an end-to-end EV charging solution to its customers, whether this is commercial customers or residential customers. Just as an idea, SpotPoint operates more than 62,000 charge points in the UK, and are existing partnership with strong businesses in order to develop further charging infrastructure. So they are working with a lot of car manufacturers as well, which are a key enabler also of the electrification of the fleet, and also strong partnership with Tesco, Lidl, PepsiCo, and DHL. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I would say to encourage the growth of EV, we see a few elements that needs to be done. So first is maintain some strong incentive for the switching for a certain period of time, because this will help people see the benefit of switching to an EV. There is necessary investment to be made in renewable and nuclear, and EDF is already doing that. This is necessary because if you want to have a low carbon transport, you need to have low carbon energy. And in order to bring more renewable on the market, you need also to consider the flexibility. And I completely agree with Natasha on her point on the fact that flexibility is a key part of the net zero transition. But I would say also that it's very important to keep the light on energy efficiency, if I may, because energy efficiency, saving energy is absolutely key and is absolutely necessary when we are considering to put more assets consuming energy on the grid. So let's not forget about the energy efficiency. And finally, the last point I would say is the smart charging and V2G. We need to be able to have access and to optimize the energy which is stored in the cars, which is the V2G. We need to be able to smart charge these cars in order to optimize the energy consumption based on the capability to produce this energy. And all of that will help us to deliver the appropriate network investment. We know there will be network investment, it will be necessary to do some network investment, but this needs to be the last in the series of things that needs to be done in order to make sure that we are doing the right one, the necessary ones, and not starting with this investment. And that's it for me.
That's great, Vincent, very good indeed, and great to see that innovation from EDF. I'm now going to switch to National Grid and Graham Cooper, and he's going to look at these two questions. What are the barriers to electric vehicle take-up and transition? How do we accelerate the net zero infrastructure needed to support the transition to low carbon and electric vehicle use? Okay, over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be able to talk to you, and there's some really good points raised already. So let me just do a very quick trot through. So my name is Graham Cooper. I'm the Project Director of Transport Decarbonisation of National Grid. National Grid is obviously at the heart of the UK's energy system. And we're busy thinking about the transition to net zero and clean transport and heat. But it's also important to make sure that transition happens without leaving anybody behind. You know, we've already had flagged the cost of new vehicles, and there are those who cannot participate. So thinking about National Grid as a business, we've got the four principal core parts of the business. So ESO, the electricity system operator, the bit that's managing real-time supply and demand. Electricity transmission, so the bit that owns the big pylons, towers and substations. Gas transmission, so the gas network across the UK, and then National Grid Ventures, which is our ventures business, most probably known for owning or sharing ownership of interconnectors between the UK and other markets. So I'm representing principally today electricity transmission, the wires and substations. I mean, the simple analogy from my perspective is for those who are not into the engineering, is effectively National Grid is the motorways of the energy system in England and Wales. So when we think about supporting the growth of electric vehicles, yes, most charging is going to happen relatively slowly because vehicles spend a lot of their time stationary. So this will be at home and workplace. That's absolutely part of the distribution system and will be important for the uptake in EVs. But that needs, as we've mentioned before, that needs to be really quite smart. The nice thing is about by having smart charging, actually, you help the growth in renewables, because if you can dump clean, cheap energy into decarbonised heat and decarbonised transport, actually it helps the further investment of wind and solar. However, just coming back to the sort of the barriers to EV uptake, we spent a lot of time talking to stakeholders in the market, and range anxiety, or the perception of range anxiety or experience anxiety, is absolutely a thing. Most people who have an EV kind of get their head around it. But if we're going to have the first and only car in a family being an electric vehicle, for people who are not necessarily understanding and early adopters of how this works, what we need is 3 C's. We need consistency in the charging experience. We need continuity across the whole of GB. And those 2 things will then bring you confidence. Confidence is the absolute key to success in this space. So when we were talking about those charging experiences, at home, at workplace, we appreciate that high power en route charging is not going to be the largest volume of charging. It's probably going to be about 8 or 9% of volume transfer of energy transferred. But if you have an EV, you're often doing regular trips. It's the out of pattern journeys is the bit that erodes your confidence. It's the longer than the range of the car. So we looked at trying to answer that challenge, and what we observed was the mode of market failure is that we need a consistent plan across the UK. So we've seen, very recently, OLEV's Project Rapid, which is looking at a plan for consistency across England. But what National Grid did is looked at what is the minimum viable product? What do you need to be able to have an EV as your first and only car to get that continuity, that consistency, and therefore build confidence? So we proposed 54 strategic sites at existing motorway service areas. And ultimately, I mean, if you drive the UK's road network, drive a motorway, the next time you drive a motorway, please just count pylons. There's a 61% synergy between motorways and our network. So if you count pylons, you very quickly run out of fingers. So there is a role to play when traditionally you wouldn't connect EV charging to transmission, but there is a role to play for strategic infrastructure to do this. We've seen this actually. What's quite nice is Treasury have announced a £500 million fund to help enable this. I guess the next piece in there is when we look at the timing and when these things will happen and how this will work, the big challenge we have right now is, particularly with energy networks, is if the transition to decarbonising heat and transport goes really swimmingly well, no one is going to thank the energy networks. If the transition doesn't go well, I can give you 3 guesses who the blame will be pointed at. And so there is a real need here to look at least regrets investments in infrastructure. I fully appreciate the EDF point at building infrastructure is the last thing you do. The challenge we've got though is in this market making mode, there are some least regress investments that will need to be made to help make the market. And that will obviously then allow lots of flexible mechanisms to come into play. So really there's just a role here for this whole systems thinking. We're trying to bring energy, transport, and digital is the glue that will grow and glue that transition together. But we mustn't think in silos. As made point before, we do need to think about considering the heat element as much as we do the transport element and the relationship between the two. So I'll stop at that point because we could talk about this for forever, but I'll leave it back to you.
Thanks very much, Graham. I'm going to bring in Dr. Brenda Boardman, who's an old friend, and good to see you, Brenda. I think it would be good, we've heard a lot around electric vehicles, but also I know you're going to look more around probably active travel as well, but be really grateful and interested to hear your thoughts. So over to you, Brenda. Are you unmuted? Brenda, are you unmuted?
Sorry, start again. Good to see you, and hi to everybody. There are 2 aspects to decarbonising transport. We've heard quite a bit about the vehicles that will be driven, and I want to focus much more on how far those cars are driven or what other forms of active travel there might be. So next slide, please. There are several aspects to this. First of all, because of pollution, we know that in particular particulates come from the brakes, tyres and road wear of all cars, and we know that all pollution, whether NOx or particulates, is particularly harmful to health, and that this has been linked quite strongly to the exacerbating COVID-19. So what we want to do is not just transfer to electric vehicles, we've got to have less vehicles, full stop. We've got to have less congestion, less particulates, less pollution. So next slide, please. So therefore we've got to create active travel opportunities. And one way in which this should probably happen is to create local, safe, active travel networks as soon as possible. We're beginning to look at that in Oxfordshire, and it's nowhere near as easy as you'd like it to be. So this will lock in and enhance, we hope, the present levels of cycling and walking, and haven't they been welcome? Do things like create green ways and segregated cycle routes, etc. So this will definitely include, particularly in the short term, transferring road space over to pedestrians and to cycle routes. That's not just in urban areas. We've got to have really good cycle routes that go between urban areas, which are fully segregated, and segregated doesn't mean a white line. And I think that the opportunity to support e-bikes for those of us that are, and this includes me, infrequent or relatively new cyclists, a large proportion of journeys are sort of 8 to 15 miles. It's probably the biggest section of distance travel is in that road category, that trip category, some of which could be done by e-bikes, even if whoever it was said they were in Bristol. Next slide, please. There's been wonderful phrases about cheaper for everybody and not leave anyone behind. Well, this is a quarter of the population or households we must not leave behind, because 22% of households don't own a car, and 25% of individuals who are over 17 don't have a driving license. So we've got to recognise that a lot of the active travel approach is about people not getting into cars, and some of it is also about getting car owners to use other modes. So we've got at least 25% of households or people, whichever you want to use, who need alternative forms of transport. Thank you. Next slide. Local areas and accessibility planning is extremely difficult, but the more rural the area, the more difficult it is. But it's very difficult to get all people, especially that quarter of the population, to get access to services, especially as in the near future, we are asking them to do it without public transport. But there are a lot of people for whom public transport, even when it is available, is extremely expensive. You know, you have to get on a bus to go to somewhere to get cash to get the bus back. So increasingly, I think it's going to be important to get the services to the people, whether it's an ATM, a bank, a doctor, dentist, whatever, that this has got to be available locally rather than try and get everybody to use an expensive and difficult public transport system to some other area. And there's this wonderful new concept called a 20-minute neighbourhood, that all your basic needs are accessible within 20 minutes by active travel. It doesn't include getting in a car. They've got it down to 5 minutes, I believe, in Paris. So your definition of what's an active 20-minute neighbourhood is up to you. But it's a totally different focus on people being able to have access to the services that they need locally. And it certainly builds on the experience that I've had locally of COVID-19 response is there's a much greater stress on local communities and purchasing local food. Next slide, please. So we need to have much of transport needs place-based solutions. The aspiration for the not too distant future is that no journey should require a private car. There will always be an alternative available. If you're in a rural area, it might be that it's a community bus or shared taxi or whatever, but there should be an alternative. And in particular, I've been doing a bit of looking at how children going to secondary school in rural areas or peri-urban areas have sufficient access to that school so they can get there safely, and underline safely, by bus, walking or cycling, so they don't have to get in a car with a parent. We've got a lot of housing developments proposed in Oxfordshire, and we have a very bad history on getting those developments to be accessible by active travel networks. So I think we're giving up on good promises by the developers to the local planning authority and requesting that new housing developments do not proceed until the safe active travel network is there and is in place. We've got to reduce car dependency. Thank you. I think there's one more slide, is there? Yes, me. Just so you know what the coalition stands for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brenda. That's really, it's quite shocking and startling, isn't it? Those figures around car usage and access to vehicles. But, Very, very interesting. All the contributions very good indeed. I want to open up the debate now. We have spent a lot of time, I think, talking about the wonders or the opportunities presented by electrification of our transport. And I think we should open it up a little bit more if we can, in terms of the broader picture around rail, all modes of transport as well. We have covered a lot of ground already. But before we do that, and I'm very keen for people, I'm going to go to the chat and pick people out, just to say that probably Jake Sumner, I will come to you at some point to get ready. Laurie Quinn, I'll bring you in as well. And probably, but before we do that, I'm going to bring in some pre-prepared questions. And the order of that will be Rachel Skinner from WSP. So get ready to unmute. Rachel, I can see you there, ready to go. And then I'm going to probably bring Milda from Manamaliti. I probably said that wrong, Milda, from the Railway Industry Association. And then I think there are similar questions from GemServe and Low CVP and Transport and the Environment. That's Trevor Hutchings from GemServe, Andy Eastlake, and Greg Archer. So let's start that on that running order. So it's Rachel, Milda, Trevor, Andy, and Greg. Okay, Emily. So over to Rachel now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill. So I guess I'm going to touch in part on an area that Suki started to talk about, but also maybe try and broaden things out a bit from some of the other speakers so far as well. It strikes me that for decades we've structured our transport business cases where we want to make government-funded investment decisions around that project's ability to generate economic growth primarily. So in our transport world, we know it's all about reducing congestion, improving safety, generating new land values, that kind of thing. As Suki mentioned, none of these aspects at the moment takes full account of the carbon cost or benefits, or indeed some of the social side of things either. Coming back to the carbon though, specifically for today, to me, that's to do with both the embedded carbon to do with actually building whatever it is, but also the whole life, the emitted carbon that results from having the piece of infrastructure in place once you've actually built the thing. So I am really interested to get any thoughts from the speakers today in terms of how fast we should seek to move to adjust those business case techniques in order to make better investment decisions in the context of net zero carbon, but also how best to do that in practice.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So, and we'll do Rachel and then Milda, and then we'll ask other people to come back briefly. Okay, Milda, you're there. Unmute.
Hi there. Hi, this is Milda from Railway Industry Association. My question was that the advice currently is to avoid public transit at all costs, and given that we are really focusing on behavioral change for people to use active travel and public transport, what can we do to ensure that this does not become a wrong kind of behavior change and people just sort of start using cars and avoiding public transport? Thank you.
That's good. So does anybody have, who'd like to come back and sort of try and tackle some of those questions? Suki? No? Brenda, I'll come. Brenda and Suki, did you want to respond? Yeah, okay, Brenda and Suki.
Thank you very much. I particularly want to follow on from Milda. One of the things we've got to do, we know we've got a problem. I mean, just take a city like Oxford, and we're beginning to discuss, well, the councils are beginning to discuss it. You're quite right, we've got to avoid public transport in the short term, and that includes buses. So what is being looked at is the way in which we prevent the growth of car usage into the centre of the city. That may mean doing things like cordoning off car parks. It may mean things like bus gates so that private cars cannot go through the bus gates normally, and therefore truncate the normal rat runs through the city or the access points. We're also looking at, or we hope we're looking at, the provision of e-bikes at railway stations, and much, much better parking for bicycles of all sorts at modal interchanges, but particularly railways, so that people, or park and rides, so that people can get off a car, get off the rail if they've come by that, and get onto an e-bike and not use other forms of transport into the city centre. And looking at e-bikes in particular, there is a considerable dearth of really secure bicycle parking for the valuable e-bikes. Several people have told me that they're reluctant to just park it anywhere because it's, you know, over £1,000 perhaps or something. So that's just a contribution. I don't know that, Rachel, I'm not really the person to answer that, but except that I would say, don't delay. We've got a fantastic opportunity at the moment on the impacts that everybody has, I think, appreciated as one of the silver linings to the COVID crisis. That, you know, that people talk about listening to the bird song, smelling the roses, being able to cycle safely with your grandson, etc. We've got to have a new approach to transport, probably from today onwards.
Can I dive in? One of the interesting factors from the first question, the one thing I think most people miss is the value of time. So when we're thinking about all of these things, you know, even my regulator, Ofgem, measures many, many metrics, but doesn't understand the value of time. If we're on a trajectory to net zero, then it's going to get more and more difficult the nearer to net zero we get. So thinking of one of the metrics that ought to be considered is do as much as you can now. Don't wait for the perfect. Good shouldn't be, you know, the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. But I also think that picks up on another useful point. If we have this sort of temporary hiatus around public transport use for a relatively short window until we have, you know, proper inoculation and those sort of things come forward, there is a window now to look at how do we rebase electrifying the trains or you know, cleaning the trains that we have now, revisiting the buses. So at the moment, you know, the work on buses has been a little bit sporadic and pilots. There could be a whole step change that we could kick off now, because getting the right infrastructure in the right place to allow that wholesale change is disruptive. If we were to able to get on with that, we can actually then, you do the worst, most dirty, most time-consuming bit soonest. That should mean everything gets easier. So my only then final comment is, if you then are able to get collective groups together, I mean, the challenge with anything, with anything of these sorts of investments is, if I were to propose it, it looks like I'm voting for me, right? So actually what we need is a collective, that collaboration of the right people to be able to share the risk and responsibility of making a decision as to what is the collective best decision we can make now. And let's get on with it, because what you then do is buy yourselves time. And on that point, I'll be quiet. I think I've hoped to answer a bit of two of those questions.
Sure, I think that's a very popular point, because we do just have to get on with it and seize the day, as they say. So,
shall I just come in and just give a couple of observations? So I agree with all of that. I think one of the things that we've been looking at is giving confidence to the passenger with regards to public transport, and especially on transport hubs. Actually, how do you think about transport? And I think Graham's point is excellent. Stopping dwell time. How can you do that? That's going to be a difficult challenge, especially the way some of our stations are currently structured. But you can actually do some temporary measures to allow reduction in dwell time, and think about family units travelling together and actually giving them some sort of dispensation to be able to obviously sit together and so forth. So you can sort of increase some capacity there. I think the other thing, just in terms of Rachel's question, which is an excellent one, which is one that we've been grappling with as well. I think we need to move as quickly as we can politically. There's a real goal, there's a window of opportunity, as I said in my presentation, that we can move now to get the benefits that will need to happen downstream. And it's not a fundamental reinvention of the business case model. You could still, for example, look at the strategic case, get some early indicators whether it actually picks up on biodiversity and environmental issues before it actually proceeds to the next phase. But the acid test, and I think the Under-Secretary mentioned earlier, is get enough value for carbon. I think without that, the economic case is very difficult to compare, not only in the transport sector, but other sectors as well. Because if you're going to make comparisons across different types of investment nationally, you need that value, and that value hasn't been implemented yet.
That's great. Agreed. So I think, if I'm right, that Greg isn't actually on the line anymore. Is that right, Emily? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
As far as I can see.
And I think Laurie has also left. So I think what I'd like to do, if Trevor Hutchings is there.
Hello, Jill. Yes, I'm here. Hi, Trevor Hutchings from GEMSA. Thank you, everyone. Really great debate. Sorry to come back to EVs again. I know Jill wanted to broaden it out a bit, but I wanted just to ask my question, which really plays on Graham's point around building confidence and normalising EVs for the consumer. And I think one of the things there that's been mentioned already that will help with that is getting interoperability right, getting roaming right, so that there is a really seamless experience across different network providers, and innovations, data can be shared in a consistent way. And it was a point that the government's appointed EV Energy Task Force picked up, that there needs to be some standards around all of this. Yet it's at the moment sort of who's responsible to take that forward? Should it be left to the industry, or should the government intervene in this space to really drive that forward? So I'd be interested in the panel's views on that.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to go to Andy Eastlake. Nice to, well, I can't see you, but I know you're there, Andy. Can you, and obviously no CVP has got a vital contribution in this area. So Andy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jill. I'll let Graham answer that previous question on EVET, because we've just come off an EVET 2.0 call earlier, so I think Graham can probably cover that. But I guess one of my questions is, net zero at the moment is missing, and I'm picking up Rachel's point, is missing the embedded emissions. So net zero is an operational measure of zero emissions, and specifically in transport, but it doesn't look at the embedded. Electric vehicles are great. They're best when they are used a lot. When you sweat that battery with zero emissions every mile you drive, it's really good. If you park it in a garage and only use it for 4,000 miles a year, it's actually not a particularly good way or low carbon way of providing your transport. And I think we need to change our metrics, and I'm interested in how can we reset the metrics to really drive zero emission journeys, zero emission miles, not just zero emission vehicles, which in a worst case isn't really going to service it. And it comes to the other point about what we need to do is to get the vehicles that are on the road, firstly, reduce the number on the road. Secondly, make sure they are used really efficiently, really effectively, and that asset is sweated when it is a zero emission asset. So it's picking up some of the points. In fact, actually, on Graham's comment, buses were certainly the fastest growing or fastest adopting sector for zero emissions, and mass transit by zero emissions is clearly a very good thing. So should we be focusing on those target areas over the private car in the near term? The other, apologies, Jill, but the other key element that I had, which I threw in as a question, was we actually have some near zero solutions right now in sustainable, renewable biofuels that can contribute to the current here and now. I'm not saying that biofuels on their own are the long-term solution. Sustainable, renewable e-fuels, maybe, synthetic fuels in aviation are accepted. Shouldn't we be looking at some of those solutions to decarbonise the vehicles that we've already got at the same time as the acceleration of electrification? It's not one size and forget all the other solutions. It's actually all of these levers need pulling as hard as possible.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to bring in Jake Sumner, if you're there, Jake. Well, you look like you're there. So, and you broaden up. Then I'm going to throw it back open to the panel, And hopefully Lord Oates and Baroness Randerson, if you've got anything to say, that would be good as well. Okay, Jake.
Thank you. And just following up, I suppose, on my question and Milda's as well, it's really the point which sort of been touched upon, but rail carries a lot of people over a long distance, and electrified rail is an efficient use of power and on emissions. And so high-speed rail on rail is key, certainly on high-speed rail zone in the longer term for achieving that modal shift, but also frees up capacity on existing lines in order to then help with freight, for example, and further passenger experience to get more rail journeys. And that would, with integrated with local and regional transport systems and active travel, is the real sort of game changer and moving that forward. HS2 doesn't feature, for example, in the transport decarbonisation plan because it's considered to be a baseline. But what's sort of missing from that is the embedded carbon, as people have said. So all those cars have all that, and then not recognising those benefits of the rail can achieve. So that was really, I suppose, a point and a question back to the panelists and the sort of reflection that we need to make much greater use of where other countries are doing this and are recognising the value of rail, and also it helps with aviation as well, and aviation market. The Scottish market is between London and Scotland is the biggest one. Getting high-speed rail down to 3 hours will have a dramatic effect. We've seen the huge change that's happened on the Paris, Brussels, and now Amsterdam links. So there's that, and then finally, I would just say alongside that is then electrifying the other parts of the rail network, and 58% isn't electrified currently, and there's a big role for hydrogen to play in that, which just emits pure water. So that was a sort of some indication, because electric vehicles obviously have an important role for changing the existing diesel and petrol engine, but aren't a solution for these long distance and medium distance, and particularly leisure travel, which is increasingly a part of the transport numbers, but rail has a major role to play.
That's great. Thanks for mentioning the word hydrogen.
Can I come on that one?
And I should have said I was speaking. The High Speed Rail Group has sort of produced a report on that, and we're producing another one shortly. So, and I spoke in part on behalf of them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, part of that, is getting freight, off the roads onto rail. It's a really key point in the grand scheme of things. So, Graham, your name came up in dispatches there. So I'm going to go to you first.
I'll bring a couple of points. So let's do the last one first. National Grid, obviously, we own the gas transmission system and the electricity transmission, so we're technology agnostic. We're not picking winners. The thing that's often missed with hydrogen is at the moment 97% of the hydrogen produced for this purpose comes from a dirty source. It comes from methane. So until we have large-scale carbon capture, usage and storage, hydrogen, there's a bit of a warning shot. You're moving an emission. That's not to say hydrogen doesn't have a place. It has a very, very important place on the net zero pathway. The other way to make hydrogen is using clean electricity through electrolysis. So what we need is little incremental steps around power to gas, making hydrogen from clean electricity. That buys us the time to do the large, big jumps around proving carbon capture and storage. So the first thing is, yes, in use, hydrogen is very clean, its byproduct is only water. Please don't forget to ask, where does the hydrogen come from? So that's the first one. The second piece around, there are 2 points. So the first one from Trevor Hutchins. If you think about how the mobile phone industry changed about 15 years ago, by setting these standards, you can see the potential for transport and EV charging. So I'm old enough to remember picking a mobile phone based on a coverage map, and the phone was just a dumb device. And you paid pounds per month and pence per minute. It was terrible. Now we've bundled that all together. Roaming works. You pay one price, you get all that you need. If you can see what happened in that sector, you can see the potential to get charging to the similar sort of space. And then the final piece that I was going to add into, I sit on the government's EV Energy Task Force. So thank you very much, Andy, for flagging that. One of the 21 recommendations was around the need for sort of smart charging and roaming and all those interoperability pieces. So it's worth looking at those. Those were the advice was asked by government for those recommendations. Government is absorbing and thinking about those recommendations, and is actually we're just about to start to kick off the further iteration, which is how do we look at delivering against those recommendations? So who owns it, who drives it, who benefits from it? So that is just starting to kick off. So I think that answers about 3 of those questions. Sorry, I'll leave it to someone else.
Yeah.
Can I go next?
Suki, yes, okay. And then I'll come to Vincent. And Brenda, do you want to come in? Yeah, okay, we'll do that order. Okay, thank you.
So shall I go first?
Suki, yeah.
Yeah, just a very quick one on the well, and yeah, actually we do talk about electrification and national electrification for the main lines, and absolutely we should do that. And of course HS2 is an example of that, where it supports capacity as well. What I want to say though is there's a real opportunity here, not only on the back of COVID-19, but also devolution, to think about transport planning in the locality, and actually really thinking locally why we're moving, what infrastructure we're moving from to. You know, transport is a derived demand, and if we're clever about it, we can actually think about nudging in a particular way, whether it is electrified rail, but also road, electric vehicles or active travel. I think we traditionally have always thought about transport modes and their very strong verticals. I think now there's an opportunity to think about a regional basis, which actually thinks about local requirements, and goes back to one of Brenda's points around this 20-minute idea. Actually, I think that's really important, that anything that supports that localism is going to be an important dynamic of what this sort of decarbonisation agenda needs to do to make sure it's resilient society-wise long term.
Okay, Vincent.
Yeah, just maybe a quick comments on the car who is not parked and is not used on the battery. It's a pity to have a car and an EV that is not used. I think for me there are 2 elements to kind of answer to that. First is something which is linked to the behavior change, because what I see as well is the ownership model will definitely change, and we see more and more share car options, solutions where you don't own your car and you are just using the car which is available in your street, which means that you will have less car and each car will be used more. The other answer to that is also what I mentioned in my presentation, is the vehicle to grid. So when you are not using your battery, having the possibility, or when you are not using your car, having the possibility to put the battery available for someone to do something with the energy which is in the car is also an answer, because in that case, your car will do something else which is not just transporting you, but it will contribute, thanks to the battery, to the grid stability. So I think we need to think in a way where a car is not necessarily anymore something that you own and is only used, and the part of the car which is the most important, the battery, is not necessarily only used. So I think there is a change of ownership approach, and also a view on how we can create value from the flexibility that can make people happy to put their car available for some grid services. And maybe just on the hydrogen elements, completely agree with Graham. For EDF, the only hydrogen that you can consider is the one which is produced from electrolysis from a renewable source of energy, because this is the only way to go really to net zero, when you are generating something which is a low carbon, but you are not using carbon to generate it. And EDF is investing in that sphere. We believe in hydrogen. We believe in electrolysis of hydrogen. It's still expensive to produce hydrogen that way, and we are trying to understand how we can match together the best sites in terms of renewable generation, in terms of hydrogen consumption, to put an electrolyzer on these sites and have all together the customer, the generation, and the energy supply. So it's definitely it's a big question for EDF, and it's a key part of the net zero transition. So completely agree with you, Graham. Let's look at where the hydrogen comes from.
Okay, very good. And Brenda, just quickly.
Thank you very much, Jill. I just want to make 2 points. I'm not especially answering the questions. I think we've got to think a bit about the size of vehicles. One of the most recent statistics I heard was that for every electric vehicle that is sold at the moment, there are 17 SUVs sold. So at the moment, we are getting a very large market fleet of cars in society. And I don't know the relationship between the proposed electric vehicles and their size, but it would be really good if somebody is doing something to make sure that they're not all SUVs and that they're slightly smaller. They're already a lot heavier than the traditional cars, hence the problems with particulates. And secondly, we haven't talked very much about bus services, and certainly what is happening locally to us is that before the coronavirus problems, we were getting bus services to various communities cut because they weren't cost effective. But actually buses are the way in which many low-income householders get to work, again, COVID apart. So whilst I utterly support electrification of rail, we do need to remember that for the majority of the population, it's the better off that commute to work by rail and the less well off that commute by bus.
Good point. Okay, I'm going to just get everybody worked up, lined up. I think Ash Gupta, Pradeep Amarusu, nice name, and Jim Coleman from WSP, if you're there. I'm also going to ask the MPs or parliamentarians that are here whether you wanted to come back at any point. Please just put your hand up or unmute yourself. It'd be great to get your thoughts on some of the comments that have been raised in the debate so far. So we have got Brigitte, we've got Jim, and Ash. Is Ash that? Yeah, and Ash. So I'll bring in Ash Gupta because I think you've been waiting there a long time, Ash. So I'll bring you in. Okay.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm from sunny Edinburgh. This is one for Graham Cooper.
Okay.
I'm working very closely with a team in Trondheim in Norway, and they had to create, then launch, and then test Shell's global deep sea exploration fleet with huge electrical machinery. The spikes and harmonics created were terrible. When they solved that problem and delivered the ships and got back to Trondheim, where EV penetration is 75% of sales in some months and overall penetration over 50% versus R3, the grid around Oslo and Trondheim is failing with harmonics, voltage surges, spikes, transients. There's 265,000 substations, which the regulator doesn't allow the DNOs to upgrade. And if they don't do it, and electric cars proliferate the way the government wishes them, and we all wish them to, how will these substations cope? Because when they explode, they're covered, the transformer cooling is very carcinogenic, it oils. And we had one blow up just outside Holyrood, and we had to evacuate Dynamic Earth, the Scottish Houses of Parliament, and McDonald Hotel. And it wasn't a terrorist thing, it was an overloaded substation. So it's a very important problem, and unless you're technical, most people are blind to what's going to happen when ground source heat pumps and EVs proliferate, and you're talking about single-phase homes and a three-phase grid. What's the solution?
I really wish I could give you an answer, and I'm not sure, and I don't think we have the capacity here. I mean, it's probably best taken offline because you're asking some very technical questions, and I would hazard a guess that there are not a huge number of technical people on the call. So if we're probably best taking that offline, if I'm perfectly honest. But email me directly. I'm very happy to connect you with our engineers who are looking at resilience, who are looking at capacity and having a look at these in great detail, but also working with the regulator to make sure that we can attend to these sort of things in the right time. So let's take that offline, I would suggest.
So will I get that from you, Jill? Graham's email?
We'll connect you.
I'm very happy to be connected.
Thank you.
But I think, Ash, you raised an interesting point in terms of what can we learn from different countries, particularly at this stage. And, we clearly don't always have the right right solutions, but if we're going to accelerate decarbonisation, we need to really capture that. And I'm also glad that you've mentioned Scotland and, you know, very important part of this discussion. And Alan Brown, you might want to come back at some point on this. But I'll quickly go to Brigitte and Jim next in that order. Okay, Brigitte, you unmuted? No.
I think she's left the conversation.
No, she's on the screen. So, okay, Jim, are you there? Yeah.
I am here, Jill. Yes, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
We'll put her on. Okay, Jim, hi.
Yes, thank you, everyone, for the presentations and the debate. It's been very interesting. I am Head of Economics at WSP. I'm a colleague of Rachel's. My interest is in the economic consequences and the economic dynamics around this whole discussion and this whole transition process. And I think the transition towards net zero, decarbonisation of transport, the energy infrastructure that goes with that, it provides huge opportunities and huge potential for the creation of new jobs, for upskilling the workforce, for creating all sorts of interesting value-adding economic activity all over the country. I guess my question is, how far are we thinking about the strategy around that, and particularly the labour market strategy, because we're talking about a lot of technologies and a lot of different infrastructures, and that is going to need a very highly technically qualified skills base. And that skills base exists in part and in places at the moment. And if we look at the government's levelling up agenda, and before it was hijacked by coronavirus, and that is about taking growth to parts of the country which have not seen significant rapid growth for quite a while. Now, this agenda that we're talking about right now is an opportunity to do that. But are we thinking enough about how to structure that labour market response, the investment in training, the investment in education, so that we get these macroeconomic co-benefits out of this whole decarbonisation process?
Yeah, very good question, Jim, particularly around the levelling up and green jobs, green skills, innovation. You know, it's you know, these are all game-changing, you know, times in our life. We've never had this opportunity, so yeah, very good. Can I bring in, because I know Baroness Randerson, you've got your hand up, so I'll bring in Baroness Randerson and then Lord Oates, and Natasha, you've also got your hand up, so we'll come back to you, and then I'll throw it back to the panel and we'll probably end there if that's good. Okay, Baroness Randerson.
Thanks very much, Jill. I think the point I wanted to make relates very closely to what Brenda was saying. We need to see the whole picture. We have concentrated on emphasising the aspects that relate to energy efficient, zero emission transport, but actually how we deal with them in terms of strategic priorities and handling, you've got to look at the whole of transport. So to give you the obvious example, we've been talking about electric vehicles and how to encourage people to buy them, but we also need to look at how you discourage people from buying ICE vehicles, and particularly SUVs. You know, the emissions have gone up in the main fleet of cars in recent years, or steadied and failed to go down because of the huge number of SUVs that are now sold on an annual basis. And I recently asked the Minister a written question, about what the government was going to do to discourage the purchase of SUVs. And I'll have to say the answer was seriously unsatisfactory. There appears to be no holistic approach to this. They're targeting environmentally friendly methods of transport, but they're not doing the other half, looking at the other half of the equation, which is discouraging the rest. And it will be the same with every other thing you look at. I won't give you more than one example, but we are only looking at half the picture.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. And Lord Oates.
Thanks very much. I found this a really fascinating discussion. So thanks to all the presenters and thank you for the APPG for putting it together. I'm relatively new as energy and climate spokesperson for the Lib Dems in the Lords. So I've been learning a lot. So thank you for that. I was pleased about the point that our colleague from EDF made about the importance of energy efficiency in all of this, because I think we can sometimes get taken away by the excitement of new technologies and not do some of the basics on energy efficiency. And I think that's true in the transport sector, and it's of course true in other sectors of decarbonisation. I had two questions really. One followed on from Jenny Randerson's very important point there about incentives and disincentives, and I was actually going to ask what the panel view of the role of incentivization and taxation in pushing people to the right, helping them make the right decisions. And the second thing was a more technical question really, and it was on this issue of hydrogen. I very much take the point that obviously there's not much point using hydrogen if it's not created by clean energy sources. I just wanted to understand a bit more about what the challenges and obstacles were to creating it from renewable sources. I mean, obviously I understand it's expense, but what is it that makes it so expensive, and is there sort of technology potentially coming down the track that could crack that? Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody who can answer the hydrogen question? Vincent?
I'll have it. Go on, Vincent. You go first.
Okay. So on the hydrogen question, I think the fact is that the electrolysis of hydrogen is still not at its infancy, but it's still a quite early stage in terms of technology. There are a few projects on the right size, I would say, that are becoming to be industrial, but it's really a question of being able to scale up. And I think this is really related to your first question on the incentives. I think we can really make the link between the two, because for me the incentives is a way to accelerate something, is a way to enable a development of a new technology, because you bring the incentive for a certain period of time, which will make the markets buying these things, which will make the industrial developing the right technology, which will make it becoming cheaper and cheaper to a point where you don't need the incentives anymore. And I think if you apply this approach to the electrolysis of hydrogen, of water to generate hydrogen, then you have exactly the same effect, which is an early stage technology where it still need to prove the scalability in terms of being industrially big enough from an industrial point of view to deliver what is expected, needs to have more volume, needs to have more capacities, needs to have more projects coming out of the ground. Today, these projects are not able to come out of the ground because it's too expensive. And again, if you compare the two technologies, there is a factor 4 or 5 between electrolysis and the methane cracking, I would say, the chemical production of hydrogen. And so you need to find a way where you can help the development of the technology. You can have more projects, then it will become less expensive, it will become more common, and you will have something that is viable without the need of the incentive. So for me, the incentive is an accelerator, and hydrogen probably needs that now to reach the scalability that it needs to reach in the next, I don't know, 2, 5, 10 years to be one of the best or one of the biggest way of decarbonizing our economy.
So can I come a little bit, to add a little bit to that? When we were looking at 80% reduction in carbon emissions for 2050, theoretically you could have got there by electrifying everything. Now we have a net zero pathway. You can't get there without hydrogen being a function of that. So the important thing is, a lot of people often fall into one camp. It's either electrify everything or it's hydrogen, and there's no place for both. The only way we get to where we need to get to is by having both. So it's not a case of either or, it is and. If you put, it's about also applying hydrogen for the right use case. So if you put, I don't know, a kilowatt of electricity in a car and you get a mile, you need 6 kilowatts of electricity to make hydrogen to do the same mile in a hydrogen car. So what you start to see is hydrogen is going to have some really strategic uses where electrification is not the primary, isn't the primary answer. But you're absolutely right from the perspective that, yes, stimulating clean hydrogen so that we can start to make that transition is really key.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm conscious of the time. Natasha, you want to say a few things. I'm going to wind it up. So if anybody wants to just have one last shot, just put your hands up. Okay, so I've got Alan Brown from Scotland, and Brenda, Natasha, and I think we'll do, so Natasha, Alan and Brenda. Okay.
Great, thank you. So just to add a few thoughts, just I suppose in summary to a lot of the questions that have been asked and answered. So I think just going back on that first one around hydrogen. So in terms of Centrica, we see kind of upwards of 20% of heat being electrified, but that of course means that you need other items to fill the gap. So for us, hydrogen we see is definitely part of the solution. I don't think, I'm kind of with Graham here, we're not in the either or camp, we're in the both. I think that goes for also transport. So when we talked about transport earlier, green gas in particular is something we're doing for HGVs through our Barrow Green Gas acquisition. So that is something that we think there is a role for gas within transport as well. I think that thinking about incentives, I mentioned earlier that actually the decisions we make around our British Gas fleet, of which we have 11,000 vehicles, is very much driven by incentives and also policy, the policy landscape. So if I give you an example, we've got a number of vehicles within our fleet that are diesel, and we're looking to move them onto electric vehicles, so either plug-in hybrids for the interim or battery electric. And so when we do that kind of commercial calculation, we very much have to look at the price differential between an internal combustion engine and an EV. And I know lots of people talk about that, but as you start to look at the price gap and you start to add up the various incentives around benefit in kind tax, the grants and various other items within there, the margins become quite small. And actually, if you start losing parts of that incentive, then you do start to dial back from that. So that's really why we think it's important to have those in place until cost parity is reached by the middle of the 2020s. So that's I suppose that's the bit behind that. Also, just to echo thoughts from Vincent at EDF, energy efficiency absolutely shouldn't be forgotten about, and Lord Oates mentioned that as well. On the energy part of our business, that's a big drive for us around energy efficiency, and we're very much of the view that if you can't do the smaller, easier things now, it's going to be far more difficult to do the big interventions that we'll need later on. So I think I'll leave that there, but I just wanted to share those thoughts with you before we finish.
Fantastic, thanks, Natasha. And Brenda, sorry, no, I'm going to Alan. Alan, just want to hear your Scottish voice.
Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, IT issues meant I dropped out a couple of presentations. A couple of speakers did seem to speak on the importance of energy and energy strategy in terms of linking with decarbonisation of transport. So how do I, as an opposition spokesperson, make sure the UK government actually drives forward the right strategy? We've been waiting the white paper for a year. What my concerns are, and some people might disagree, but there's a real determination to go ahead with more and more new nuclear. And that seems to me not to necessarily be the right strategy, because there always needs to be looking at that whole picture. Talk about having a smart grid, and a smart grid that can integrate with local battery storage for EVs. Panelists have correctly spoke about the need for hydrogen, so that's investing in carbon capture and storage. So there needs to be a real holistic approach. And I think looking at transmission charging in terms of the grid as well is part of that. So how do we make sure that happens without it being piecemeal by piecemeal, and suddenly one decision that's taken for nuclear, for example, might then prevent other sensible decisions and investment further down the line?
I suppose one of the answers to that question is that the All-Party Parliamentary Group is, was created to build that cross-party consensus about how do we embed and accelerate some of those principles and actually change policy. And that whole acceleration process, which we've talked about this afternoon, is key to that. So, you know, and it's so important, you know, in terms of the nations. And we've also talked about, you know, localization and, you know, that response to the COVID-19. We've got to have a much more localized thinking as well as national. And it is different, you know, in Scotland, blah, blah, blah. So we do, I think, you know, stay in touch. I'm just going to quickly go to Brenda, and then I'm going to call it a day because we're at 5 o'clock.
Yes, I'll try and be brief. That's not usually my skill, but still. Just to reply to a couple of things to Lord Oates on incentives versus regulations. Incentives are much slower. They work if the government's got the money. They warm up a market, if you like. But if you really want action, you have to regulate. And obviously, if you regulate, the cost to government is virtually nil. The costs are elsewhere in the system, if they are there at all. In terms of employment, I don't know enough about employment and the transport industry, but I would like to say, if you look at energy as a whole, and we've mentioned energy efficiency a couple of times, and I've never been quite certain whether we're talking about energy efficient cars or energy efficient buildings, but there is a great deal of employment created, and it's relatively low skilled employment, if what you do is have mandatory minimum standards for the efficiency of all our buildings, whether domestic or non-domestic, and that takes place throughout the country, because we all live throughout the country. So if you take away the demand for heat, because you've made homes more energy efficient, you haven't used that electricity for heat, and you have more electricity available if you need it for transport. And whether or not we need more capacity, which I know was the subject of your first discussion, is one of the very big and difficult calculations. But a colleague of mine who I completely trust said that if every household had an electric vehicle, and if that electric vehicle was only charged at night, there would be no need for extra capacity. So you can see how complex and interrelated all of this is, and that one of the things we need to do is make sure that we've seen this as a holistic issue, much more than transport is normally dealt with. And I think my final comment, Jill, sorry to go on, is we must discourage car usage. The idea that we're going to spend £27 billion on new roads and create a demand.
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Absolutely, she said.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry.
If you spend that if Rishi Sunak spends that £27 billion on active travel, I'm very happy. But it must not go on new roads. We must stop creating the demand for more cars. We can't afford it. We can't afford it on every single possible level. So I think thank you for letting me participate.
I think we got the message there, Brenda. That's very good. This is the second in our decarbonisation series. And the next one is actually on the 9th of June, just next week. So we will hopefully see some of you all again. But that's our Net Zero Homes and Communities. Our finale, when we bring the whole series together, our key findings and recommendations, is on the 16th of June. We will be in touch, as they say, to make sure you're online. It's been great to have you, all of you. I'm sorry, but Parliament has really gone back to normal when we've got division bells, but now we've got mile-long queues. But I think we pulled it off, and I hope we've had excellent contributions. Thanks very much to all our panelists and all our sponsors and the University of Oxford. So that's Centrica, Barratt, National Grid, WSP, Atkins and EDF. So that's all for me, and thanks ever so much for taking part. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you very much.
APPG.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.